Australia's annual headline inflation hit 6.1% in Q2 this year, which is the highest since the early 90s, outside of the introduction of the GST. And while we may be past the peak in quarterly inflation, annual inflation is likely to keep rising, and we're forecasting a peak of 7.4% by the end of this year. Higher inflation disproportionately affects lower income households, particularly at times like the moment, when inflation for non-discretionary goods and services is almost double that of discretionary goods and services. Inflation in Australia is lower and took longer to accelerate than many other countries around the world. While it's 6.1% in Australia, in the US it's 8.5%, in New Zealand it's 7.3%, and in the UK it's over 10%. And there have been some common global factors, particularly with very high commodity prices and supply constraints as well. And on the supply side, Australia has also had to deal with the extensive flooding that we've seen over the first half of this year. But demand is also a key driver of inflation in Australia. Even though tradables inflation is running at about 8% over the past year, non-tradables inflation is running at about 5%, so still the strongest that we've seen in many years. And inflation has been quite broad-based across Australia's CPI basket as well, with about 80% of all goods and services seeing annualised growth of 2.5% or more in Q2, 2.5% being the middle of the RBA's target band of 2 to 3%. Wages are not a key driver of inflation in Australia so far, but demand is, and that's a big reason why the RBA is lifting rates so quickly now. While we think inflation will start slowing through next year, we think it's going to take quite a while to come down and get back into the RBA's target band of 2 to 3%. There have been, both globally and domestically, some shifts in the drivers of inflation. So for example, if we're past the peak in globalisation, with more barriers to movement of goods and services and people around the world, that's inflationary. We're also seeing, after several years of businesses focusing on efficiency and driving down costs, that businesses are now starting to think more about building resiliency into their operations and their supply chains, given the shocks that we've seen over the past few years in the form of bushfires, COVID, the invasion of Ukraine, and the flooding that we've seen this year as well. And that's inflationary too. We're also seeing businesses increasingly pass on their cost increases to consumers as well. Inflation in Australia is too high at the moment, particularly since it's far outpacing wage growth, with real wages falling 3.3% over the past year, and households' purchasing power actually falling. The RBA does want inflation to get lower, but not too low, particularly when we consider that for several years leading up to the pandemic, inflation was undershooting the RBA's target of 2 to 3%. This reflected a period of weak wage growth, stagnant living standards, soft consumer demand, which undermined demand for business goods and services as well. We think inflation is going to be quite sticky, and it won't be until the second half of 2024 that we actually see underlying inflation get back into the RBA's target band of 2 to 3%. Thank you.